culture. I guess my starting point is that free speech is one of the most important and precious of all human rights. Without free speech, we cannot really contemplate a modern democratic society. And sadly today, there's become a sort of trend towards saying things like, that offends me, I don't like that, you can't say that. The idea that something should be prohibited because it causes offense is profoundly dangerous. There is no right in human rights law to not be offended. Indeed, many people would argue that it is a prerequisite of human rights law that it includes the right to say things that people find disagreeable, even offensive. And if we look back throughout history, we see that some of the greatest ideas by some of the greatest people in history caused great offense in their time. Galileo Galilei, Charles Darwin, Sigmund Freud, Karl Marx, all of them came up with ideas that created profound offense in their era. And how much diminished we would be if, on the basis of that offense, their ideas had been banned and censored. So to me, it is very important to acknowledge as a starting principle that there is no right to not be offended. Now, I can speak from personal history. When I was growing up in Australia in the 1960s, I was opposed to the Vietnam War, which Australia was fighting alongside the Americans. And I attended anti-Vietnam War protests. At the time, Australia was gripped by its own mini version of McCarthyism, where anybody who expressed liberal progressive opinions was denounced as a communist, and you could face threats and violence and lose your job, be ostracized. It was a very, very dark period in Australian history. And because I had attended an anti-Vietnam War protest where I was seen by my boss at work, he hauled me in and announced that I was going to be fired. And I had to plead with him to reconsider because he said that my mere presence at this protest would bring the company into disrepute. So that's just one example of how inhibiting a person's right to freely express their point of view can have dangerous consequences. And in my case, I luckily did, by the skin of my teeth, maintain my job. I think that it's also really important to remember that in decades past, it was usually left and liberal and progressive opinions that were subjected to censorship, to no platforming, to cancelling. In my childhood, I can remember, in my teenage years and beyond, I can remember so many progressive people who were denied the right to speak in public platforms, were never invited to debate on TV and so on, because they held what were deemed extreme views or views outside of the mainstream. So I find it very strange and disturbing that today, some of the people now calling for censorship and no platforming are people on the left. When the left has been through this period and been the victims, they are now turning around and being the perpetrators. Now, I say the left, it's not all the left, of course. There are many honorable leftists who will defend staunchly freedom of speech. But it is a worrying trend among some sections of the left that too quickly, someone who expresses a disagreeable point of view, there are calls for them to be sacked, banned, denied a platform. I think that's the wrong way to go. Having said that, I do believe there are certain circumstances when it can be right to legitimately restrict freedom of speech. And I'll give you those three examples. The first is where someone makes false, damaging allegations. In other words, maybe claims that person X is a paedophile, a tax fraudster, a rapist. When someone makes false, damaging allegations like that, it's not free speech, it's an abuse of free speech. And those kind of damaging allegations can have very devastating consequences for the person who is being falsely maligned. The second is an instance where someone engages in harassment, threats and menaces towards another person, where they are in fear and anxious about their safety because of the way in which they're being treated. And the third example is incitements to violence, where again, incitements to violence actually close down free speech because the people who are having violence incited against them are scared, afraid, and reluctant to speak out. I'll give you an example of that. Back in about a decade or more ago, a group of Jamaican reggae singers put out dancehall tracks advocating the murder of LGBT plus people. The Jamaican LGBT plus group, J-Flag, was afraid to speak out because they feared that if they raised their head in public to speak out against this murder music, they would be targeted and possibly killed. So those incitements actually closed down debate. And I'll come back to this issue a little bit later. I have, of course, on a number of occasions, defended Christian street preachers who've said some pretty vile things about LGBT plus people. Of course, I haven't agreed with what they've said, but they weren't being threatening. They weren't being inflammatory. They were simply saying things like homosexuality is immoral and so on. So a good example is the case of Harry Hammond. Harry Hammond was a street preacher in Bournemouth who held up signs saying homosexuality is immoral, lesbianism is immoral, things like that. But he didn't badger anybody. He didn't use offensive, abusive language. He didn't provoke any incidents. He was just expressing his point of view. And as much as I disagreed with him, I thought that within a free society, he should have the right to express his point of view and that people equally should have a right to protest against him. So I supported protest against him, but when he was arrested and charged and eventually convicted of behavior likely to cause a breach of the peace, I think, or it might have been under Public Order Act, one of the two, I felt that was a step too far. And I actually offered to speak in his defense when he sought to appeal. But Harry Hammond was so homophobic, he didn't want a gay person defending his right to free speech. So that was his call. Going back to the Stop Murder Music campaign against the Jamaican reggae singers, the dancehall singers, they were putting out songs that encouraged the shooting, burning, hanging, and drowning of LGBT plus people. These were clear incitements to murder, which were criminal offences. Yet they were not being prosecuted. They were allowed to get away with it. Now, there were other singers who did say some offensive things about gay people, but we chose not to target them. The LGBT plus group I was involved with, Outrage at the time, we certainly protested against their homophobic language, but we didn't produce a major campaign. We reserved the major campaign for those who were inciting murder. And so we began this campaign. Well, first of all, we tried to persuade them to think again. When that didn't work, we went to their record companies and production companies. When they gave us short shrift, we then realized we weren't going to get anywhere. So we decided that we would seek to cancel their concerts, that we'd find out where their concerts were taking place, particularly in Europe and North America, and we would get venues to refuse to host them. So we were seeking to no platform them on the basis that they were inciting murder and that is not legitimate free speech. It's a criminal offense. And indeed, we did succeed in getting many of their concerts cancelled. I think more than 30 or 40. It hit them in the pocket. And then eventually, because they were starting to lose money, they began to change their tune. And I wouldn't say they all stopped completely their homophobic, violent lyrics, but they did dramatically reduce them. And some did stop, some did stop. Now, we were condemned, Outrage was condemned as racist for having this campaign against these singers. We did not target them because they were black. We didn't even mention their race. We were targeting them because they were inciting murder. Murder. And you can bet if a white singer had been inciting the murder of black people, all our critics would have applauded any attempt to prosecute them. But because we were targeting a group of singers who happened to be black, even though that was not the reason for our protest, we were deemed to be racist. And I was subjected to months, even years of disgraceful, defamatory attacks by people on the left and in some sections of the black community because of this campaign. You know, we made repeated statements that we were anti-racists and this was not a campaign about race. It was about incitement to murder. Anyway, the campaign was eventually successful, but we paid a very heavy price. I had to be under armed police guard for months because of plots to kill me because of this campaign. Anyway, to move on, I think that overall, the way to deal with bad ideas, outside of the three exceptional circumstances I've mentioned, the way to deal with prejudice and hatred and so on is not by bans and censorship, but by countering bad ideas with good ideas, with better ideas, with showing why they're wrong. So if you simply ban something, the opinion doesn't go away. The person is not discredited. The person just carries on and their supporters carry on because you haven't challenged them, you just simply banned them. That doesn't resolve the issue. It doesn't change things. And to give an example here, Germaine Greer was under calls for her to be banned from speaking at Cambridge University on account of her very deeply offensive, disagreeable views about trans people. Now, I totally disagree with Germaine's views on trans issues. She's a great feminist in many other ways, and I've admired her for a long time, but I think on trans issues, she was wrong. But I said, no, don't ban her. Get another speaker to speak against her, to show why she's wrong, to counter her arguments with ethics, evidence, research, personal experiences to show why those views are wrong, and hold a protest outside her talk, show that we disagree with her. And again, you know, I was denounced as a transphobe for not demanding an immediate complete ban on Germaine Greer. The way I operate has always been the same over the years. You know, back in the 1970s and 80s, when homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia was very extreme and severe, I would nevertheless go on every available TV and radio program to counter bigots, because I knew the way to defeat them was by engaging them in open debate, to show why they were wrong, to expose the flaws in their arguments, the contradictions, the hypocrisy, all the things that were wrong about what they were saying. Today, I'm sad to say that many people say, oh, I'm not going to debate that person, they're a bigot. Well, I didn't debate these people because they were a bigot. It was because I wanted to show their bigotry and expose it. And I think the proof of the pudding is in the eating. It's the actions of myself and many others who debated these bigots that eventually their ideas became discredited. So when I went on a program to debate against far-right Tory MPs who said things like gay people should be locked up or quarantined during the AIDS crisis. By countering their arguments, I didn't necessarily persuade them, but they weren't my main target. My target was their followers and their audience, the members of the public who was listening to the radio and TV program, to help change their hearts and minds. And I think you can see that when we began this very intensive campaign of doing these media debates, that over a period of several years, public opinion began to shift in favor of gay equality. And of course, there are many different reasons why that might have happened, but I'm certain that part of the reason was the fact that we engaged to expose these people. In terms of no platforming, the idea originated back when I was a student in the National Union of Students in the early 1970s. And it was conceived as a particular policy to counter the far-right National Front, which in those days was advocating not mere discrimination against Black, Asian, and other ethnic minority people, but marching into those communities, terrorizing people in their homes. And that, to me, was a red line. That was a step too far. That was harassment. That was menaces. That was threats. And in some cases, these people on the National Front openly incited violence against non-white people. So I supported the National Union of Students having a no platform policy on the National Front. But I also supported a policy of arguing against them, exposing them, countering their views as well. And I think we can see that that campaign, which I concede was controversial, that campaign did have positive results. When we began the campaign, and I say we, I mean the whole National Union of Students, the National Front was riding high in the polls. It was getting 10, 15, even 20% in some elections. But over a period of about 8 to 10 years, as a result of the no platform policy and the work of the Anti-Nazi League, support for the National Front plateaued and then declined. So I think that the policy was, in hindsight, the right thing to do. It wasn't a policy that I endorsed happily or willingly, but I thought for the sake of preventing a greater evil, it was necessary. And I've got to say that I actually lived in an area with a black, substantial black population at the time. And I saw firsthand the terror and fear the National Front created in those Black and Asian communities. And I didn't want to put my neighbors and friends through that. Today, the National Union of Students no platform policy is limited strictly to 6 organizations, both far right and Islamist extremist organizations that oppose human rights, whose members are linked to violence and threats of violence. And again, I think it is right that those 6 organizations should be subjected to a no platform policy. It doesn't mean to say they can't hold their meetings, but just means that the National Union of Students will not facilitate them and will not approve of them. An allied campaign much later, in fact, in the last 20 years, was the campaign I did with the LGBT plus group Outrage against Islamist preachers who were speaking at universities with impunity. These preachers were openly saying that a woman who has sex outside of marriage should be murdered. They were saying that LGBT plus people should be murdered. They were saying that Muslims who turn away from their faith should be murdered. These were clear incitements to murder. And they were saying, they didn't actually, most of them did not say murder Jews, but some came very close to it, and also inciting violence against Hindus as well. Outrage organized a campaign all by ourselves, because none of these liberal left-wing groups that you would think would defend women, gay people and others against murder would be there, but they weren't. They ran a mile. We organized a campaign to get these specific preachers who are inciting these horrendous things, to get them banned from speaking at universities. And again, we had huge success. And that huge success eventually, over a period of years, resulted in those preachers no longer making those outrageous incitements. Well, again, I say most no longer made those outrageous incitements. But again, what was shocking was that sections of the Muslim community on the left denounced us as Islamophobes for challenging Muslim extremists who were inciting this violence, including, as I said, against Muslims who leave the faith, or indeed against Muslims who share the wrong type of Muslim faith. So they're inciting violence against Muslims who were Ahmadis or Sufis because they were the wrong kind of Muslims. But we were told we were anti-Muslim and Islamophobic because we were challenging these preachers and getting their talks banned. But again, we also backed it up with campaigns to educate and inform, to expose why these ideas are wrong, to actually give platforms to liberal progressive Muslims who were able to speak why they, as Muslims, rejected these extremist views. So we were actually empowering sections of the Muslim community who are being silenced by these far-right Islamist extremists. Again, I had an example of no platforming, well, an attempted no platforming. It wasn't no platforming per se. It was a variation on no platforming. What I call is no invitation. I had been invited some years ago to speak at Cambridge Christchurch University for an LGBT event, and the organizers also invited Fran Cowling, who was then the National Union of Students LGBT plus officer. She responded that she was not prepared to speak if I was on the platform because I was a well-known racist and transphobe. When asked to produce the evidence, she couldn't, because of course there was none. And she kept the pressure was kept on the university, and I cannot say, with any certainty what the purpose was, but certainly some people interpreted it that she was basically saying, if you don't get rid of Tatchell, I won't speak. Now, maybe she wasn't saying that, I don't know, but that's the way some people interpreted it. Anyway, the university, to their credit, stuck to their guns and said, no, I am invited to speak. There is not a shred of evidence that I'm transphobic or racist. You've been asked to produce the evidence. You can't. So Tatchell's speaking. You are still invited if you wish. And Peter Tatchell said he's quite happy to debate alongside you. Fran Cowling just ran a mile. And when I exposed all this, I was denounced as being a bully. I was the bully. And even worse than that, I was told that I'd outed her to her family. I mean, she was the National Union of Students LGBT plus officer and an out lesbian bisexual woman. I mean, the depth to which these people stoop to try and discredit you is phenomenal. And of course, I'm not the only one who's been through this. I'll come on to others in a short time. So in the end, I did speak, and the meeting went ahead fine. There is, of course, a legitimate concern about some universities where no platforming has been extended beyond the original National Union of Students intention, and indeed beyond the current no platform policy. That is true, but the scale of restrictions on free speech in universities has been exaggerated. And this was found as a result of two pieces of research. One was by the Parliamentary Human Rights Committee and the other by the BBC. They did in-depth investigations and found that, yes, there was a small number of incidents where people were unjustly denied the right to speak at universities, but these were tiny. They were not the general trend. Yet if you read newspaper reports around the time, you would think that universities were left, right and centre cancelling people and denying them a right to speak. So, you know, I think all these things have to be put in perspective. But there have been some incidents. So, for example, Mariam Namazi, the Iranian feminist, an ex-Muslim who has personally suffered a great deal at the hands of Islamist extremists, and have seen some of her friends, I believe one of her friends was actually murdered by an Islamist extremist. She, when she was invited to speak at Warwick University, when they were told that she was a notorious anti-Muslim bigot, withdrew the invitation. She and myself and others had to fight tooth and nail to get that invitation reinstated. So she did eventually speak. Another instance, she was invited to speak at Goldsmiths College, and the Islamic Society tried to get her banned under the no platform policy. When that failed, they tried to ban her under the safe space policy. You know, they said she was would create nerves and anxiety for Muslim students. Well, first of all, the meeting was by invitation and no one was obliged to attend. Secondly, Mariam Namazi's never said anything against Muslim people. She's targeted Islamist extremists who hold the views that I protested against in universities, that women who have sex outside of marriage, LGBT plus people, and Muslims who belong to minority faiths should not be allowed to be heard. Oh, sorry, I got thrown by the phone. She was targeting Islamist extremists. She wasn't targeting people, Muslim people as a whole at all. In fact, she was defending them. So when she actually got to speak, the Islamic Society sat in the front rows, or members of the Islamic Society sat in the front rows and barracked her, trying to shout her down and intimidate her. Eventually, she did speak, but under great duress. Another example was the case of Imogen Wilson. Imogen Wilson was a student at Edinburgh University, and during a debate, student debate, things were said about her which she said were totally untrue, and she raised her hand to express her disagreement. And as a result, there was a vote taken to expel her from the meeting. She'd raised her hand to object to the fact that she says false things are being said about her, and that was deemed to be a violation of the safe space policy. On top of that, the meeting continued and people made further allegations, and she shook her head. And that was, again, resulted in a call for a vote to have her expelled from the meeting. Both those votes failed, thankfully. But the fact that she could even be called up to be subjected to a potential expulsion from the meeting shows, I think, how wrong and how extreme and how unjust those policies are. You know, I'm all in favor of a safe space policy where it ensures that women and disabled people and Black and ethnic minority people can speak, you know, that isn't dominated by white cisgender males. I'm all in favor of that. But everybody should be able to speak, and people shouldn't be shouted down. They shouldn't be bullied. That's quite right. But when one's simply expressing a disagreement, then I think that's invoking the policy in a wrong way. I'll just perhaps finish by saying that, as you know, the government is now pushing forward with measures to demand that universities guarantee free speech off the back of exaggerated claims that they're clamping down on free speech. again, the government in producing these demands has produced scant evidence that they're needed. Again, it's based upon exaggeration. But what is shocking, I think, is the way in which this seems to be part of a culture war policy fostered by the government. We know from leaks from some time back that the government was interested in exploiting, quote, culture wars as a way of undermining opponents and critics and garnering support from more conservative, even far-right people. Now, that is quite sinister and I think quite reprehensible from a government. You know, the fact is that what the government is doing to universities now on flimsy evidence is it's going to threaten to withdraw funding from universities and allow staff and students to sue universities if they fail to uphold free speech. Now, in principle, I don't have anything wrong, anything particularly against that. But what is, I think, shocking is that this seems to be taking a leaf out of the Trump playbook of culture wars, trying to stir up issues which are not really there. And I think that we have to be really, really careful about giving the government and indeed universities more power, which can be used to close down legitimate free speech in the name of defending free speech. So this is one of the issues that's caught up in this is, if you go down the road of censorship, where do you start? Where do you finish? Who decides? What are the criteria? And what are the red lines? I think that the government's proposals, I think, are dangerous. And of course, are quite hypocritical after the government's been telling schools they can't or shouldn't be teaching about anti-capitalism or other social movements they disagree with. And also suggesting that or supporting the government's Prevent program, anti-terrorist program, which I'm not against in principle, but it has been subject to many excessive interpretations, which actually inhibit free speech. So there's a famous example of a student, I think at Birmingham University, who was doing research on terrorism, and he downloaded the Al-Qaeda manual, terrorism manual, from the US State Department's website to critique it. And he was arrested and detained under the Prevent program on anti-terrorism charges. Eventually everything was dropped, but that was a pretty awful experience for him. So I just think the government's in a muddle, and some of this looks more than a muddle. It looks like some deliberate attempt to exploit grievances and concerns. So I think I'll finish there and open up to questions and contributions.
Well, thank you very much. Well done. I think a round of applause, even if it's virtual.